You're listening to the Public Rail Now podcast. I'm your host, Adam Barrington. On this episode, I talk with Advisory Board President of the Coalition for a National Infrastructure Bank and retired Amtrak executive, Stan Forczek. We discussed examples of national infrastructure banks in U.S. history and what one would look like in the present, as well as Amtrak, high-speed rail, and much more. For more information about the Coalition for a National Infrastructure Bank, please visit nibcoalition.com. For more information about Public Rail Now, please visit publicrailnow.org. Thanks for listening.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stan Forczek. I am the Advisory Board President for the Coalition for a National Infrastructure Bank. We have legislation before Congress to start that bank, and I believe we're going to get into the bowels of it through the conversation. I'm also a retired executive from Amtrak. Spent over 30 years there. I was the first director of finance for Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, and I also spent a lot of time, about 12 or 13 years, working in the energy area and energy infrastructure for Amtrak within the Northeast Corridor. But I also spent a lot of time on energy projects throughout the nation. I also retired from an energy consulting firm based out of Philadelphia, and for a brief while here now, I have my own consulting firm. I do a lot of work for large and medium-sized corporations within the energy sector, energy engineering sector. Sorry about that. So that's me.
Well, Stan, thank you so much for being on the program. I'm very excited about our conversation that we're going to have here. So I figure we can start off talking about the National Infrastructure Bank. And if you can, explain that a little bit to the listeners and maybe give some historical background or inspiration, like the national banking system under Lincoln, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation under FDR, and so on.
Okay. As I mentioned in the very beginning, we have legislation before Congress for the nation's fifth national infrastructure bank. The model for the bank was designed by Alexander Hamilton, and it was first put into play in George Washington's administration. Hamilton came up with the design because there was no money within the country. The country had just fought the Revolutionary War, and all the 13 states were in debt, and they really didn't have working capital to do anything, build anything. So Hamilton came up with the idea of monetizing the debt and in using those monies for infrastructure improvements. I'll give you a little tidbit of information. The monies for the first National Infrastructure Bank were actually put into the bank by Great Britain, whom we just had beaten in the Revolutionary War. They wanted to see America succeed, so that's where the money came from. The second National Infrastructure Bank was done within John Quincy Adams' administration, and same principles as the first bank. John Quincy Adams had the idea that we should be moving forward and create manufacturing as one of the baselines within the country for folks to earn a living, do certain things. So he established a manufacturing center in Paterson, New Jersey, and again, used that second bank to build all of the facilities up in Paterson and also lend out the money across the nation at the time to put in other manufacturing plants. He also created a system of canals and roadways. Roadways in that particular point of time were dirt roads, but he created that in order for manufactured goods to reach ports, to reach different cities, so that they could be put into motion. as you had mentioned, Adam, the third national infrastructure bank was done by Lincoln, and he had two problems. He wanted to continue the manufacturing end, and he also had to pay for the Civil War. That money had to come from somewhere. So they used the third bank to do both of those, and he was responsible for the nation's uh, first intercontinental railroad, transcontinental railroad, I'm sorry, going from east to west and back east again. So that's where the third one came into view. The fourth one, and the biggest one of all, and one of the biggest uh, banks at the point of time, was done. It was initially legislated within Hoover's administration, but Hoover had not finalized anything, so it was taken over by Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt used the bank to do all of the programs that everybody's heard about, and not many people know about it, like the projects to put people back to work, to get the country out of the Great Depression, as was designed by Hoover, but taken over by FDR. So he wanted to get everybody situated, get us out of the Depression, and from there, obviously, we know what happened. World War II happened, and he used the fourth bank to fund all of the manufactured goods and everything else that were used for war. That bank was highly successful, a little bit more successful than the other banks. And unfortunately, it had ended, it had come to term in 1957. So that's the last great thing. And in the end, some of those monies underneath the bank were used for the interstate highway system by Eisenhower. So those are the histories of the four banks. Again, the fifth bank that we're working on now is the exact same model. The exact same model is being used around the world to do infrastructure banks in all countries. I think China has 8 infrastructure banks. Japan has 3 or 4. France has a few. England has a few. So it's being used all over. It is a very successful model, and there's no reason to improve it. All we need to do is get it moving. And why do we need it really? Uh, we all know that we have infrastructure problems, and we think we know what's going on with economics, and some do, some don't. But the infrastructure bank, as it works on developing and upgrading all of the infrastructure around the country, it circulates more and more money because more and more people go to work, they have jobs, they are creating this infrastructure. It's manufacturing more for the infrastructure. So the money is used to just perpetuate itself and actually supercharge the economy. Like we keep on saying, we want to do it, but the country never reaches that point where we can supercharge everything. I mentioned Roosevelt's bank. Roosevelt's bank actually turned a significant profit because of the way the bank works. And not only does it build the infrastructure, but it actually circulates more and more money, creates a situation where it turns a profit for the government. So I hope that answers the Adams question and gives you a little bit of a flavor for the National Infrastructure Bank, or as I said, the fifth National Infrastructure Bank.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. And it's funny, like, so the way that things work currently is, we have to go to Congress every year to ask for money, essentially. Like, we have to, get funding. And there was
Correct.
a recent article that I saw from the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. And I think they don't explicitly say anything about, an alternative like a national infrastructure bank, but it makes a good case for something like that because there's legislation from the House Appropriations Committee Republicans for fiscal year 26, and the funding bill for transportation, urban housing and urban development and related agencies. According to the article, it transfers approximately $2.8 billion from the bipartisan infrastructure law to pay for this year's normal rail appropriations title. And that would take away vital funds that are needed to improve passenger rail infrastructure and expand passenger rail service throughout the United States. So I would bring that up to kind of, ask you about your time at Amtrak and what kinds of hurdles you faced trying to get that funding.
Absolutely. And let me say one thing, because I never mentioned it in the brief outline of the National Infrastructure Bank. The bank itself, the legislation is for a $5 trillion bank. That seems like a significant amount. But if we look at what the American Society of Civil Engineers puts out, the need within the country, no matter what we're talking about, whether it be rail, roads, buildings, or anything like that, the real need's over $10 trillion. So that's the kind of money, that's the kind of volume that we really need in this country to supercharge everything. When I was with Amtrak, I was with Amtrak almost from the very beginning. Amtrak was created in 1971. At the end of 1973 is when I came on board. And my initial position was director of revenue accounting because it was just taken over from the railroads. So I had to work on the revenue side. From that, I was called in. I don't know why. I think because I was the only real accountant at the time, and people were always asking me questions as it relates to operations and how operations should be taken care of. I could tell you a funny story, but then I'd have to use some names, and I don't really want to do that. But and I gravitated over to property or asset management. And in 1975 was when Amtrak started having different railroads, bankrupt passenger railroads, to convey all of their assets. So we would have to put them in the book. And I was one of the team leaders that actually went around the country observing the conveyance process and getting ready to put all of those assets on the books. That continued from 75 all the way through. The last piece that was conveyed was the electric transmission system in the Northeast Corridor, which was done in the early to mid 80s. So everything came on board during that time. While that was going on, and I'm sure you've heard of this, there was a lot of fighting going on because when Amtrak was put into service by the Congress, the Congress's idea was simply the reason why we have bankrupt passenger railroads is because those railroads do not know how to manage uh, um, their operations, and that's why they always operated in the red. That's not necessarily true. The Congress did not understand what it really cost to run a railroad, and they quickly found out after all the assets were conveyed that Amtrak is not going to be what the Congress wanted it to be, and that was a for-profit railroad operation. It just does not exist. It does not exist in any country around the world, and Amtrak couldn't do it. And there would be a constant fight going on. You mentioned the process that we're doing for 2026's fiscal year budget. Now we're fighting for this, fighting for that. Well, they wanted Amtrak to operate significantly, they operate everything that they put into service significantly lower than what the receipts or the revenue would be for running the railroad. And when I say significant, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that the Congress kept on fighting, and we had to fight for everything we had. We cut as much as we could, but and one of the problems is the fact that, and I'm sure you realize this, Adam, that Amtrak, although goes coast to coast, it only has the operating section that they own and can operate the way they want to within the Northeast Corridor. Everywhere else, they have to operate under the rules of engagement that the freight railroads have in place. And back in the 80s and early 90s, the freight railroads were basically charging exuberant amount of monies for the switching, for the running of trains on their right of way, and that's how the whole fight started, whereby Amtrak could not make up the money that they were paying for the freight railroads to run on the lines. And the interesting part about it was Amtrak had suggested, well, we'll take certain lines out of service, and the Congress would never agree to that. They wanted us to run every train that we had taken over, and that's what created the deficits outside of the Northeast Corridor. So it was a hard road. It's a hard road that we had to travel on, in that Congress was always fighting. Today, it's a little bit different. Amtrak has been able to negotiate some very fair contracts with the freight railroads across the country. And although it still needs funding, it needs a lot less than what was being pointed out in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s. So it was tough on everybody within the company, but it's like a baby. It grows up. It has to do things to find out what's the best way to do it.
Yeah, and I highly recommend everybody who's listening check out the nibcoalition.com. There's a great section about public-private partnerships, and I
Yes.
think like it's
Yes.
what's funny to me is like, whether it's Amtrak or whether it's USPS, like the attempt to sort of insert market logic on public services that shouldn't operate that way seems to be like a
Yeah.
consistent
Yeah.
feature, and that seems to be like a major part of the struggle here.
Yes. Yes. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah,
I hope that
yeah.
I hope that addressed your question.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, and we can kind of I had like a piggyback question for that one as well, because
Go ahead.
you
Go ahead.
mentioned that there's a House bill for the National Infrastructure Bank, but there's kind of like a holdup in the Senate. So I was hoping we could talk about what's that holdup about, because you would think we hear all the time politicians talking about infrastructure and we got to bring back manufacturing, and you'd think somebody would want to be that person whose name is associated with building affordable housing, creating good paying jobs, like getting rid of lead pipes and things like that. Like, so
Right.
what's the I don't understand the hesitation.
There's a hesitation within a lot of groups, not so much on the Democratic side, because they're always looking for different ways to do things. On the Senate side and the Republican side, uh, there's several things that surface up, and they really can't get into the National Infrastructure Bank. For example, um, we have talked to so many senators and Republican folks on both the House and the Senate, and they their eyes gloss over when we start talking about a $5 trillion bank, because they're not understanding it doesn't take federal funds. It's hard to understand that the bank is just as monetized debt. Um, and I should have mentioned this 2 questions ago. the way that the bank is set up, we would go into the Federal Reserve, and within the Federal Reserve, there are Treasury bonds that are have been bought by different organizations like countries around the world, labor unions, folks with a lot of money, and they want to invest that money because the bank would give them an extra 2% of interest, more than what the Federal Reserve Bank is doing. So it gives folks an opportunity to make more money. But when we talk to the Senate and we talk to a lot of Republicans, we can't get past the thought of the $5 trillion. They keep on thinking it's coming out of the coffers, and they don't have the money for it. Instead of listening and reading where the money is coming from. And like I mentioned in the very beginning, the 5 trillion is maybe half of the real need, and people don't realize it. And if we were to say 10 trillion, they would just walk out of the room because it's just not there. So basically, I'm saying that the Senate, particularly Republicans, are afraid of the amount of money and really don't get into the bowels of the legislation to understand that it's not taking any money from the federal of the federal funds or the budgeted funds. It's coming out as a monetization of debt, and until people get a firm understanding about that, they don't want to get into it. For example, you know how many people are in uh, the House of Representatives? There's over 400. We the most co-sponsors we have on that legislation within the House is 59. So we have a hard time convincing people about the bank, and in particular, it's the Senate and the Republicans.
Yeah, it might be worthwhile kind of like talking about to kind of dispel any kind of concerns or, how are you going to pay for it type
Right.
arguments in opposition. Because from my understanding, basically the National Infrastructure Bank would essentially just be like a regular bank. It would go to the private sector. It just asks the private sector essentially to invest money into the bank for in return for stock, preferred stock in the bank that's equal to the price that they're investing, and they would actually be paid more than they're currently being paid out in the treasuries. Is that
Correct.
right? Yeah. Yes.
Correct.
Is that yeah? So I mean, it is kind of funny to me that, like you said, are they just not hearing you, or are they not doing the reading, or like, because it just seems like 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 they just have to be walking into this thing with like blinders on to not see how would benefit. There's not going to be any new federal taxes. I mean, it just seems like a
You're,
no-brainer.
you're right, and there's a second portion or a second answer to this, and that is, and I'm sure you've seen this, but you put a new building, a new supermarket in downtown wherever, there's a politician standing there saying that he approved this. He got the ball. He put it over the finish line. All right. The National Infrastructure Bank is not political. It is not being run by politicians. It's not going to be, if downtown, any city, Chicago, downtown Chicago needs a better system of creating windows to move trains in and out of, let's say, Chicago Union Station or the terminal there. Um, it's not. It doesn't have to be approved by Danny Davis, who is the congressman for that area. It doesn't have to be approved by anybody else within the legislative branch in Illinois. It does not have to be approved. It's who's ever going to put it in, and in this case, it would be Amtrak, or it could be an Amtrak and a combination of other railroads. Um, those people are the people who are going to pay back the loan to do that work. So politicians never get involved with, well, we have to do this before we do that. And that sort of bothers them. I know that we've had several meetings with retired politicians. I'm a couple of governors, one from Georgia, one from another one of the southeastern states, and they pointed that out in the very beginning, that it's going to be hard to get people behind this because they want the credit. They don't want to find the money, but they want the credit. So that's another issue with the Senate and the Republicans.
And again, like I was saying earlier, I mean, it just, to me, I'm not a politician, so maybe that's the problem here. I'm having trouble understanding, because to me, it's like if I'm either in office or running for office, I look at something like the National Infrastructure Bank, and I'm thinking, okay, we're gonna have all these, like, we're like the whole bringing back manufacturing, we're going to create jobs, we're going to solve some of the problems with income inequality, we're going to build affordable housing, we're going to fix the lead pipes and replace them, and in thinking about droughts that we're seeing, my wife's from Las Vegas, so we're pretty much, we always pay attention to what's going on in the Southwest and the West Coast in terms of water. So these massive water projects that we need, I'm looking at
Right.
all that and I'm thinking, I want to be the person whose name is connected with all that. So it's like, even if there's some decision-making power or whatever, like that they lose having something like a national infrastructure bank, to
Right.
me, it seems
Right.
like, why would you want to be the one that's like, oh yeah, remember that guy or remember that person? They were the ones that were advocating for all these things that improved our lives. It's just,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
And
Right.
and going back to that legislation from the House Appropriations Committee, Republicans, it also prohibits funding for the 3 high-speed rail projects in California, Texas, and Minnesota. And I think when a lot of people consider what they'd like to see in passenger rail here, they want the kind of fast, sexy, high-speed systems that we see in China, Japan, and so on. But the high-speed rail question is pretty complicated in terms of the United States, and so our take as Public Rail Now has basically been that we would like to see the infrastructure we already have that's just sitting around put to use, fixed up. And so I'd love if you could talk a little bit about how the situation in the U.S. is different than somewhere like China or Japan, and how it kind of complicates the prospect of high-speed rail here.
Right. Right. Uh, the first thing that you have to consider, and I mentioned this when I was talking about the fourth bank, was the world had a war back in the late 30s and 40s. And that war decimated the countries that you just mentioned: Japan, China, all the countries in Europe. And right now, they all have high speed rail. They all have it because their country was decimated. So they could start from the very beginning. In the United States, we don't have that. We have not had that luxury. We have maybe close to 20,000 miles of track around the country. Some of it's used, some of it is not being used, but it's still there. And most of it was put in the mid to late 1800s. It's 2025. So we have all of that, and we've never been able to resurrect rail the way we were saying we want to, because high speed rail is a little bit different. You have to have straight corridors of the rail, or the right of way. Whether you do it elevated or on the ground or under the ground, it has to be straight. Because if you're going to go 250 miles an hour, you can't go, like the Northeast Corridor has curves. Uh, some of them are really, that really have a lot of degree of movement to either the right or to the left. So you can never get a train to go that fast. And the Northeast Corridor was designated to use high speed rail. That's what we wanted to do. If your listeners remember, the Pennsylvania Railroad was running the Northeast Corridor or sections of the Northeast Corridor before Amtrak, and they had put in Metroliner service, which really was a train to go 110 miles an hour. So it could slow down and go through the turns at about 100 and then go back up again. But they tried to do it. And here again, Congress could not devote the monies to support that. And that's why that was even dropped off. So it's hard for people to realize that you need a specific set of structures to put in high speed rail because they're going so fast. Germany and China are now significantly above the 200 mile per hour speeds that they have for their high speed rail. And again, everything is in a straight line. It's either above the ground. And the other thing too is there's a lot of safety issues that they were able to get around because they built everything above the ground or below the ground. So people can't jump onto the tracks. I remember back in the 80s and 90s, there were people just jumping over the tracks within the Northeast Corridor and just jumping in front of trains. And then the train's got to stop, everything's got to be investigated, different things like that. In the countries we're talking about, that doesn't occur because it's either an elevated train or it's really fenced off hard and fast, or it's below the ground. I remember seeing, I had gone to London to negotiate a electric transmission project that Amtrak was trying to do with National Grid in England. I had the opportunity to go up to the station to see what the tunnel train looked like. And here again, it's just like every one of the high-speed rails, and it's like the trains Amtrak is now procuring and getting to run in the Northeast Corridor. But again, everything is straight. It comes straight into that station, straight into the station in France, and that's just the way it is. It was built that way. Why? Because they had the luxury within the late 1950s through the 1960s into the 70s to actually take the land that was decimated. I'm talking about the other countries around the world that were decimated within the war, and they built their system of high speed rail in a straight line because they knew they wanted it to go faster and faster and faster. And that's what they have. They have all their lines are straight, very few curves. If there's a curve, it's a lot of degrees less than what we see in the United States. My thoughts, and I think I've talked to you, Adam, about this, is you could make a system or you could make up a makeshift system of high-speed rail from East Coast to West Coast using good agreements established with the freight railroads, because Amtrak would have to go on and off, on and off. The other thing that you should know is diesel trains cannot reach the speeds of electric trains. It's just not possible. A combustion engine is not going to be able to propel a train fast enough to say it's a high-speed train. Amtrak experimented with what they inherited, the experimentation of turbo trains that were in use in the St. Louis area going into Chicago, and also for upstate New York. And it was tried, and it just doesn't work. It's not going to reach the speeds that we would say were high speed rail. So Amtrak could probably find a way to do it along with a friendly agreement with the freight railroads that when a train left the Northeast Corridor, it could allow for the train to move back and forth from different tracks around the freight trains that are out there, and it would be some sort of semblance of high speed rail. Uh, Here again, you mentioned California and the United States funding, taking away the funding for the Caltrain. Um, and the problem there is they, being the state of California, has wasted a lot of money. And that money is not going to be used. I think they have maybe 20 miles of track built after all these years. And I'm talking a good 25 years that they've been working on that project. And um, it makes the government think, do we really want to keep on doing it? And that's why the funding has been taken away, because they're just not building it the way that it should be built. And they're always having arguments with the locals about this, that, and everything else. I had the opportunity uh, when I was out, when I had already left Amtrak, to do some work for the LA Metro system. That's a system of above ground and below ground trains that LA uses. And I was working on projections for the energy usage. And they didn't really have a problem, but that's not high speed rail. But they never had a problem with overruns like the California trains have, or any of the other ones. So they they just overspent it, and they really wasted a lot of taxpayer money putting in what they have, and it's not going to work out for them. They have to come up with a different way of doing things if they really want to put it in. But I'm digressing away from high speed rail. I really feel that Amtrak, working with the freight railroads, can come up with a way to utilize the freight lines that are out there, and get to a speed of maybe 110, 120 miles an hour. But a lot of work has to be done because there are safety regulations, there are other things. And what'll happen when it goes in and it's going 110 miles an hour, then the issue is going to be, well, why can't we go 200 miles an hour? And that's when the big argument will start. Well, we don't have electric trains outside of the Northeast Corridor. Then it's going to become hard, because then that project to put in catenary across the United States is an extremely big project. I know, Adam, you and I have talked about the work that has to be done just to bring the existing right of way or existing road beds up to a state of good repair, to let Amtrak use them on and off as it goes across the country. But electrification is a very, very large project if Amtrak wants to go from coast to coast with electric trains. My theory is, let's crawl and then we could start walking. Let's work together with the freight railroads and see if we can find a way to get from coast to coast. And if we can do that, then you can have branch railroads to go in different directions away from terminals, like they do in Chicago, like they do in New York. And eventually we could turn them into a faster speed also.
And now I'm thinking, the Association of American Railroads, the industry group that represents the Class Ones on the freight side of rail, they had a report that came out earlier this year that was about electrification, and it it could have just been one sentence like, we can't afford it, or how are we going to pay for it, or whatever. Like, in as we've been talking here, it's one of the main points of our campaign is also advocating for catenary electrification across the board. And the Class One railroads, because they own all this infrastructure, there's this barrier there where we can't necessarily electrify everything. And I know that the National Infrastructure Bank would only apply to public services and infrastructure. So I guess how would if we did have something like an NIB, how that approach catenary electrification? Because especially with Amtrak, we're kind of on a leash here because there's all this infrastructure that isn't under the public umbrella.
Hmm. Well, I will tell you this: in the legislation that's within the House right now, there is monies for high-speed rail throughout the country, and the thought is now I told you that we carved out only 5 trillion for the legislation. We know it's more than that, and I think the full complement of money uh, is thought that we would have a significant amount of money for high speed rail. Now, how that's done is a different story because the bank does not. The bank is a bank and can afford to loan out that money to put in high speed rail, and a consortium can be built to do that. But the issue is um, the NIB does not say, well, we need high speed rail. Here's the money. It's somebody's got to come up with that consortium or that group, whether it be a group of states or a group of cities or however they want to do it, and ask for the money and sign off for it. And that money will be used for high speed rail. It's a significant amount of money. I don't have the sheets in front of me. We're talking about a large amount of money, close to $1 trillion. In doing that, it was never mentioned whether that was going to be for an electrified railroad or whatever have you. It's just that money was projected to be used for high speed rail.
Right, and this kind of is a decent segue into my next question. In a past conversation, you had mentioned about some approaches to obtaining infrastructure, tracks, what have you, from the Class One railroads, whether that's buying it and having them remain operators, or buying it and paying them off so Amtrak can be the operator. And I'd love if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Well, again, uh, Amtrak would have to get together with two other groups. One of them could be a portion of Amtrak for high speed rail, and then they would also need an engine. A Amtrak has its own engineering group, but we would need something a little bit bigger than that, a little bit more technically oriented to put in high speed rail. So that group could be formed, and they would look at it. There are different groups around the country. I'm going to say maybe 4 or 5 who have their own set of ideas how this would work out. But I'll give you an example of some of the discussions that we've had. As you get away from Philadelphia into Western Pennsylvania and Ohio, and Indiana, uh, there are freight railroad tracks that are there. Some have been abandoned, some have not been abandoned. I would see, and I think we spoke about this before, I would see that a good agreement between Amtrak or the Amtrak new group with people associated with this project And let me say something about that. That's nothing different than the group that was formed to finalize the building of the new tunnels under the Hudson River for bringing trains back and forth into New York. So there was a group that was put together for the Gateway Project. That's what it's called, to do all of that. And a similar type group could be initiated that would work with the freight railroads and go and look at the right of way. And when I mentioned the states that I was talking about, freight railroads only need two tracks. It can go to three, it can go more than that as you get into different terminals, but they really only need the two tracks. And then they would have other tracks in different sections so that trains can go around each other. But there are dormant tracks next to those tracks that have to be rebuilt. And the rebuilding is nothing more than just cleaning out the underbelly of the existing tracks and putting them back down, maybe putting in concrete ties. That all has to be thought out. But you would put in a track next to the other two that freight railroads use, and it would be on either side. And I would see where planning, again, train consist planning and everything else, they would look at those tracks as Amtrak could use those tracks that are fixed up for them and then put in interlockings at different sections where the Amtrak can go back and forth as it weaves its way down through those states. The same thing is true if you go further west. There are so many tracks out there. I was giving a little presentation um, several months ago regarding the use of the old tracks in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, that really haven't been used in 50, 60 years, maybe even longer. Refurbishing those tracks to bring the trains, the SEPTA trains, up from um, Philadelphia into Bucks County, Scranton. I know Scranton is very hungry for train service coming out of New York because a lot of their people living in Scranton are working in New York now. And train there's if you ever go to Scranton, they have so many tracks because that used to be a terminal that can be used for a different setup. But my discussion was if we could use those two sections and then take the northern portion of Pennsylvania going into Erie and beyond, you could get the starts of a high speed rail. And I'm projecting this out maybe in 20 years. The first thing you got to do is build train service. But the tracks exist. When you get to Chicago, I don't know. I walked the Chicago Union Station yard many times, and there's so many tracks, and I'm going back 30 or 40 years that are not being used. They're still not being used, and they could all be strengthened up, and even more trains can come through Chicago and go west. And there's ways to do it. They're all there. All we have to do is develop them. And the way you develop them is through a funding mechanism like the National Infrastructure Bank.
Yeah, thank you. And before I let you go, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but
Well, I thought we would go on forever. I'm sorry, Adam.
I'd love to actually, but we'll have you back on because there's so much stuff we can talk about here. But I gotta ask, what are your thoughts on the Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern merger?
I'll be honest with you that all the news that's out there is saying that this is the first transcontinental railroad in the United States, and I hate to disillusion people, but I thought Lincoln did that. Maybe I'm wrong. But I think it's a good thing, Adam. I think it's a great thing, and I'd like to see whatever group that gets formed to do passenger rail be in on discussions with the new management of this transcontinental railroad in order to see what we can piggyback on to go take passenger rail east coast to west coast for a really good trip, spending a lot less time on the train and utilizing it as another form of transportation for those people that just don't want to get on an airplane. And I think it's a great thing. I would love to see it get formulated, put into place, management be set up, and they start running. And then a discussion group could be had with those people who feel they want to use um, uh, their services and put in passenger rail services. Again, the the right of way is there, and I think a good negotiator, a person who understands rail and understands what the freight railroads are trying to do, and work alongside them and see if we can piggyback in certain portions of the right of way for passenger rail to have a higher speed line going from east to west, west to east. So I think it's good.
Great, Stan. I want to thank you again for appearing on the program. And again, I'd love to have you back on because there's so many things that we maybe didn't touch on, but we could spend hours and hours like talking, and your knowledge is beyond valuable. So I really appreciate your time. And
Adam, I would come on anytime to discuss the situation with passenger rail, especially high speed rail, because I think it's a blight on this country that we don't have those services for our citizens.
absolutely, yeah. And before we sign off here, anything you'd like to plug? Where can people learn more about the National Infrastructure Bank and maybe some of your work?
Well, my work doesn't get published. I work on the sidelines. Um, I'm like the football coach who sends in the plays. He doesn't get recognition, but the quarterback does. Um, you can learn more about the National Infrastructure Bank by going to this website, nibcoalition.com. And in doing that, you will find a wealth of knowledge of everything that we've been working on. Again, this all started about 4 or 5 years ago. So there's plenty of information in there. We keep all of our audio townhouse meetings, all of our videos that we've had in discussions with different town halls across the country. So everything is there. If people want to um, uh, go to that website, that would be something that you could look at. The other thing too is uh, there is a book that's out there, and I will get you the name. I just don't have it in front of me. It's a book concerning Roosevelt and the things that he did, and it directly mentions the RFC, which would be the precursor of this fifth National Infrastructure Bank, and it's a hard read because when I went to school, when I went to high school, we liked books that were about 5 pages long. This one's about 500 pages long. So it's good reading, but if you take your time and absorb it, it will help you out on some of the thoughts that Roosevelt had regarding all of these projects that came under his infrastructure bank.